When you're tasked with taking down the greatest threat the world has ever seen, there are very few people you can trust. And when you're faced with the devastating news that your king and confidant is dead, and taking his place will be his daughter, a woman in her early 20s, can you truly believe that she has what it takes to lead the nation by your side? Glimpse into the relationship between a young princess, thrust into the role as Queen of England, and her Prime Minister battling the looming Nazi threat. Uncover the internal party conflicts, struggles with mental illness, and the shocking death of King George VI. Learn the truth about the relationship between Churchill and the Queen. (1939). The Nazi Party win the general election and Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. At this point in time, the rest of the world was barely paying any attention to what was going on within the borders of Germany. However, a few had begun to take notice of the potential dangers of giving power to a man like Hitler. When Hitler came to power, Winston Churchill gave a number of speeches warning the government and the population at large about the dangers that Hitler posed. Churchill argued against the Munich Agreement, which gave Germany part of Czechoslovakia, and he believed that Germany would attempt to gain even more territory. Unfortunately, few people agreed with him. Nevertheless, he was right. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and the beginning of World War II was officially declared. Due to his clear foresight and strategic capabilities, Churchill was given a spot on the War Cabinet and was renamed the First Lord of the Admiralty. When Hitler invaded Norway and defeated the Allied forces, the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned after a poor showing in a no-confidence vote. As a result, Winston Churchill was named the next Prime Minister in 1940. This was the start of the rule of arguably one of the greatest leaders the UK has ever seen. Germany wanted to invade Great Britain, and in the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain commenced in the skies over southern England. Once Hitler had control of France, he began to make plans for the invasion of England. Hitler ordered bombing raids on the country. These raids were initially focused on coastal airfields and other military targets. However, the raids soon bombed further inland. The German bombers were given clear orders not to bomb cities, but after they mistakenly bombed the outskirts of London, Churchill ordered bombing of German cities. It was time to fight back. Hitler followed with similar orders to bomb English cities, including the British capital, London. During this time, King George VI was reigning monarch of Britain. He lived with his wife and two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. With the physical threat of the German forces getting closer and closer to home, the decision was made to move his family out of Buckingham Palace and out of the face of danger.
Well, the outbreak of World War II affected the British royal family hugely because they were right up there at Buckingham Palace, which was a big target for the German bombers. But they decided that they would not leave the country, they would stay there with their people, and but they obviously had to look after their two daughters. So they started, Elizabeth and Margaret started in Scotland, then they were sent down south, and they eventually stayed at Windsor Castle for 5 years, while the King and Queen went to London during the week.
Churchill gave a number of speeches during the Battle of Britain, aimed at building up the morale of the population and the armed forces.
Such are the atrocities against which we are in arms.
Shortly after Churchill became Prime Minister, he gave one of his most famous speeches. their finest hour.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Churchill's writing skills had gained him international notoriety, and his love for words and the richness of the English language drew him into a career as a writer long before he delved into politics. His ability to communicate clearly and passionately served Churchill well as a revered orator, a popular author, and a most persuasive statesman.
Of mysteries and surprises.
A formidable opponent in the debating chamber, Churchill's wit and his skill with words could quickly silence those less erudite and articulate. But where did this passion for literature begin? Long before becoming the leader of the Conservative Party, Winston took up his career as a writer. To achieve his political ambition, he needed fame and, of course, the necessary financial wherewithal. His strategy? Request postings to as many dangerous places in the world as he could, and to then write about them in newspapers and books, presenting himself as a hero and communicator. He travelled to South Africa, reporting on the Boer War for the Morning Post. He was shot at in Cuba. He fought on the Afghan border, and he faced a cavalry charge in Sudan. His most famous headlines were made when he escaped Boer captivity from a military prison in South Africa. Finally, Churchill was making the news rather than just reporting it. Churchill returned to Britain and once again stood for Parliament in the general election of 1900, winning a Conservative seat in Oldham by a small margin and becoming a Member of Parliament for the first time. He quickly became a distinctive character in the House of Commons, seemingly devoid of inhibition and fearless in his quest to persuade others to his viewpoint. More than anything else, he was exceptional in delivering pre-prepared written speeches rather than improvised narrative, and as a natural writer and public speaker, his words carried great strength.
A vile race of quislings, use a new word which will carry the scorn of mankind down the centuries. He's hired to fawn upon the conqueror, to collaborate in his designs, and to enforce his rule upon their fellow countrymen, while grovelling low themselves.
In 1904, he crossed the floor and joined the British Liberal Party. He always claimed to be more of a liberal in his heart, but he disagreed with the Liberal stance on self-rule for Ireland. During the First World War, Churchill served as a First Lord of the Admiralty, which put him in charge of the Royal Navy. He was forced to resign after the Dardanelles campaign and the failed invasion of Gallipoli, a debacle for which he was apportioned a good deal of the blame for the campaign's failure and the massive loss of life. He quickly tried to redeem himself and volunteered for the front lines, serving again as an officer in the British Army on the Western Front. After the First World War, he then crossed the floor again, rejoining the Conservative Party, and served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, where he pushed for a policy of returning to the gold standard, a sometimes controversial decision which was greeted with somewhat mixed reaction. He lost that post when the Conservatives were defeated in the general election of 1929. Whilst not necessarily popular with his Conservative colleagues at the time, he became very popular and well known in Britain, much of which was due to his journalism and writing.
The people had chosen Winston Churchill as their Prime Minister. And he spoke the words in every British heart when he said,
"We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender."
1940. The British Air Force was able to hold off the attacks, and once Churchill realised that Hitler would not be able to invade England, he was able to send troops to shore up battalions fighting elsewhere. Just a month later, the Royal Air Force fought the German Luftwaffe with resounding success, destroying a considerable formation of invading aircraft. This unexpected defeat for Hitler caused him to make a fatal tactical error and delay his plans to invade the UK, and it is widely acknowledged as one of Churchill's greatest successes during his career.
The German war machine flaunted its vast power in maneuvers that coincided with a four-power meeting in Munich.
The war dragged on, but with Hitler still making advances through the rest of Europe. Winston Churchill had been trying for many months to involve the USA and to work with US President Roosevelt, but sadly, to no avail. The US was most determined to remain neutral, but they set about finding ways in which to offer the UK a helping hand. Roosevelt and Churchill eventually met off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941 and created the Atlantic Charter, detailing the aims of the two democracies and their ideas and vision for the world after the war. This journey was fraught with risk, and Churchill's loyal detective, responsible for keeping him alive no matter what, recalls in his own biography the courage and fortitude displayed by Churchill facing German U-boats and assassination attempts just to cross the North Atlantic and meet with President Roosevelt to seal their strategic alliance and to take on Hitler together. But this wasn't enough. The UK was struggling, troops were dying, and the Nazis were getting closer and closer to victory. The Brits needed the US to officially join the war, and the push to do so came from an unexpected place.
Well, in October 1940, the King and Queen paid a visit to the BBC, and the chairman of the BBC asked them if there was any chance that perhaps his eldest daughter might contribute to the children, the evacuees, who were in Canada, Australia, North America. There were a lot of them there. And they had a program called Children's Hour, which was embryonic then. And they asked the king if he would consider allowing his daughter to do it. Well, of course, she was thrilled to do it and practiced very, very hard. And eventually, aged only 14, gave this extremely professional speech to the children that were separated from their parents.
In wishing you all good evening, I feel that I am speaking to friends and companions who have shared with my sister and myself many a happy children's hour. Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
Because Princess Elizabeth, always thinking about her younger sister, she brought her younger sister in at the very end and said, "Come on, Margaret." And "Come on, Margaret" became a catchphrase in America. The speech went down an absolute storm in America. And it was like headline news in the New York Post, you know, that this princess had given this speech to the evacuees.
To everyone's surprise, the princess's speech went down a storm and ended up aiding in convincing the US to join the British war effort.
And also politically, it was a very good thing because, of course, Churchill was trying to get the President, Roosevelt, you know, to enter into the war you know, to support us. So anything that we could do was a good thing.
This was the start of what was to be a long-lasting relationship between Elizabeth and Churchill, though the two had not yet officially met.
Londoners gave no thought to evacuating the city themselves, but they moved most of the children to safer areas in the country, and thousands of others were sent to the United States and Canada.
In December 1941, the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the next day, war was declared on Japan. Their allies, Germany and Italy, then declared war on the US. It was time for Britain and the US to fight together. The Allied war strategy was closely developed and agreed upon between Churchill, Roosevelt, and the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. After many arduous years, the combined war effort was a success. Britain and its allies stopped Hitler, and the war in Europe ended when Germany surrendered. VE Day was a time for great celebration, and parties ran late into the night. It is said that the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret disguised themselves to join the street parties and celebrations, only returning to the safety of Buckingham Palace in the early hours of the next day. Her Majesty openly admitted to sneaking out the back door of Buckingham Palace to join the celebrations and hiding her face under her army hat to avoid recognition. Sir Winston Churchill achieved international respect and a reputation as a wartime hero after victory in World War II. But the time quickly came when party politics returned.
Britain's first general election in 10 years. All over England, in city and hamlet, the polls are open to elect a new parliament and determine who will be Britain's next Prime Minister. Sir Archibald Sinclair of the Liberals, the Labour Party's Clement Attlee, or Winston Churchill, nominal leader of the Conservatives.
Churchill's campaigns, whilst met with much excitement and cheering, reflected the war hero, not the political leader.
Britain was a world power. When statesmen like Winston Churchill talked, nations listened.
After so many years of hardship throughout the war, the British public decided they wanted a brighter-looking future, and the promises made by Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party, held much promise. In 1945, after an enormous swing to Labour, and much to Churchill's surprise, King George VI asked Mr. Attlee to form a government. Churchill submitted his resignation to King George VI and became leader of the opposition.
By these, and only by these, can we discharge our duty to the future of the world and to the destiny of man.
He spent a great deal of time in the south of France, turning to his creativity for solace and focusing on painting, writing and bricklaying.
The polls, hoping his Conservative Party will be voted back to power.
1951. After 5 years in the wilderness of opposition politics, Churchill became Prime Minister once again in 1951. But it was only 3 months into his second term as Premier when the news broke that would devastate the hearts of the entire nation. King George VI was dead. It is said that although Churchill and King George VI were something of polar opposites, King George, a gentle, shy soul, and Churchill, a lively, formidable character, over time had become very close, much of which was likely due to the camaraderie and mutual support during the wartime effort. They became confidants and close friends. Over a decade before, Churchill had been a supporter of the King's brother, arguing a strong case that the abdication was not necessary and that he should be allowed to marry Wallis Simpson. However, with a shy and less than confident King George VI on the throne, Churchill had supported and served his monarch and fulfilled his duty assiduously.
Gravely ill, and even as we watched and waited, the nation prayed. Operation on the King, we read, and knew how ill he was. But success seemed to crown the skill of the surgeon. But now the King is dead.
King George VI had been struggling for some time with his health and had undergone lung surgery. Sadly, a few months later, the King died.
It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the King's death reached his daughter. When she returned from a night in the forest, it was to learn that she is now the Queen, acceding to her father's throne immediately. There is no break in the continuity of the British monarchy.
What happened was the Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were standing in for the King and Queen, and they started a big Commonwealth tour in Kenya, as it was called in those days. And the people of Kenya wanted them to be there, and they'd given them a lodge for their wedding present. And the sort of joy for them was that they were going to visit this game reserve, and there was a little place called Treetops, which was overlooking a salt lake, so you could really see the animals. You know, this is 1952, so the whole of Kenya was teeming with game, and they spent the night up there. And actually, it was during the night, unbeknownst to the princess, that she became queen. So they left their game viewing, went back to Sagana Lodge, and had a little sleep because they'd been up all night. When the news came across to Prince Philip's private secretary, Mike Parker, that the king had died, and he thought that he eventually had one of those little radios, and he fiddled with it, and eventually he heard the sounds of Big Ben, and he knew that the news was true. And it was his duty to tell Prince Philip, which was probably, he says later, the most difficult thing he'd ever had to do in his life. So he went to Prince Philip and told him the news that his wife, Prince Philip's wife, was queen. So Prince Philip was in such shock, he just put a newspaper over his face and let the news just absorb. And then he got up and he went and got the princess out of her bedroom where she was resting and took her down to the lake at the bottom of the garden. And the lady in waiting tells a wonderful story. She watched them walk up and down, and she knew that he was telling her. And when they walked back into the lodge, she was putting her arms around the princess, and she thought, my goodness, but she's queen, and dropped into a curtsy. And then, of course, they had to make their way back to England as quickly as possible, and there were all kinds of problems. Planes broke down. The queen, now she's queen, didn't have her mourning clothes with her, so she had to go all the way back in a sort of summer frock. And they had several small flights before they got on the big flight. But by the time they arrived back at London Airport, she came down the steps, beautifully dressed in her black clothes, and Prince Philip waited on the steps until she was at the bottom, and she greeted her Prime Minister. And that's how it was going to be from then on.
And meet to welcome the new Queen. There too, the Duke of Gloucester, her uncle, and the Lord Chancellor. The Premier and Mr. Attlee, leader of the opposition, are agreed in this great moment of our history. Her tour of the Commonwealth cancelled. The princess we knew as a girl and watched in the even growth of her stature comes back to meet her ministers as queen over the great lands that for 15 years acknowledged her father as head. Now the Princess Elizabeth we knew and loved returns amongst us as our queen. Before her plane, her government and leaders of the other parties receive her greeting. No queen had ever such counselors so predetermined to give of their best. No queen had ever such a people so devoted. Through the long years, she had grown amongst us, one of us. The little girl we knew has become Queen Elizabeth. The love we gave her has become allegiance.
Behind the gates of Sandringham, from the parish church, the coffin was put onto the gun carriage, and the impressively simple cortege began the slow procession to the station. Its men reverently transferred the coffin into the funeral coach of the train.
Through the London streets, where so often the eager crowds had cheered, the procession wends its silent way. This is London's day of mourning.
It is said that Churchill took this death very badly, and that those around him did not realize the extent to which he felt great sadness for the loss of the monarch.
And now the Palace of St. James, the center of the Commonwealth, London. The heralds come out, the court officials of Great Britain. Watching is the man who has shaped so much of our destiny. Here, with the Earl Marshal of England, the Duke of Norfolk watching, the ancient formula is carried out. The sovereign-to-be is proclaimed by Garter, King-at-Arms.
Churchill fell into a bout of depression. It is often said that great creative minds are the incubator of mental illness.
Glorious memory, by whose decease the crown is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. We, therefore, the lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, being here assisted with these of His late Majesty's Privy Council, with representatives of other members of the Commonwealth, with other principal gentlemen of quality, with the Lord...
With the king now dead, someone had to fill his role and rule over the UK. That person was to be his eldest daughter, Elizabeth.
Hers by right of succession, the Princess Elizabeth has agreed to accept the crown and rule as Queen.
Well, I think the reason that the Queen is referred to by some historians as the unlikely Queen is that, you know, she wasn't prepared to be Queen. She was married in 1947, and she expected to have a proper, long-ish married life before her father died. But he died quite suddenly, so she was an unlikely Queen. And also, she wasn't designated to be Queen because her uncle, who became Edward VIII very briefly, abdicated and put Elizabeth directly in the line of succession.
When their uncle, David as he was known to the family, otherwise King Edward VIII, abdicated, it was Princess Elizabeth who told Princess Margaret, and she said, "Uncle David's going away and Papa is to be king." And Princess Margaret said to her, "Does that mean you're going to be Queen?" And Elizabeth said, "Yes, one day."
Because they weren't first in line for the throne, the family were able to live quite a reserved life, privileged but reserved.
She did have a happy childhood. You know, that King George VI, her father, or the Duke of York as he then was, he always referred to himself, his wife and two daughters as us four. And they were a royal family within the broader royal family. But because they never anticipated their ranks and their position and their responsibilities changing, they anticipated carrying on as being this very close-knit, very loving us four, you know. So Princess Margaret and her sister did have hugely enjoyable and very loving childhood.
With George now king, eldest daughter Elizabeth was heir presumptive at only 10 years old. She was prepped for the role from a young age, with the expectation of one day taking her father's place. However, no one saw that day coming so soon. Upon hearing the news of the king's death, Elizabeth was expected to return to London immediately and begin preparing for her new duties as head of state and the Queen of England.
Princess Elizabeth became Queen in February 1952, and the coronation was in June 1953.
In his grief, Churchill initially showed little enthusiasm to work with the young Queen Elizabeth and doubted her capabilities, referring to her as only a child whom he barely knew.
Well, when the Queen came to the throne, she was only 26, and Churchill made the remark to his private secretary, "But she's a child." But she wasn't a child. She was very sophisticated and mature mentally, and it was a man's world, and you know, women were really subservient in those days, and the Queen was walking into this world of men who were all much, much older than her. And also she hadn't really been taught. She said there was no way to be taught. All she did was she watched what her father did and followed him.
This sentiment was shared by many who feared that she just wasn't sufficiently prepared. However, this quickly changed, and it is thought that he then took it upon himself to honour his dear old friend and to make sure Elizabeth knew her role, her responsibilities, and her duty as sovereign, and to make certain he offered her every possible support. On June 2nd, 1953, Elizabeth was crowned Queen of England, over a year after her father's passing, aged only 25. The Queen's coronation was perhaps one of the greatest and most memorable events of the century. There was, however, a bone of contention between Churchill and the Queen. These being the early days of television and mass communication, Her Majesty and Prince Philip felt it important to televise the event live for all to see. But Churchill felt this would be most unfitting, and it would allow the ordinary people to get too close to the mystique of their monarch. The Queen prevailed, and the momentous event was broadcast live on television to the nation and relayed to other parts of the Empire and Commonwealth. The world shared in the pomp and grandiosity of the ceremony and celebrated the coronation of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Churchill's entrance to the occasion cemented Winston's position as a beloved national treasure as he waited to be almost the last to arrive, waving royally to the cheering crowds. Churchill's daughter Mary is reported to have said that the Queen had quickly captivated him, and he had acknowledged her immense sense of duty. Churchill was, of course, born during the reign of Queen Victoria, so when Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, it is said he was thrilled to once again sing the national anthem as God Save the Queen.
The late King's daughter became England's second Queen Elizabeth. Carefully reared to her responsibilities, she has already captured the affections of Britons during her short reign.
He had seen Elizabeth's devotion to the crown and her country firsthand, and slowly he warmed to the young Queen. For both of them, the Queen's weekly meetings with her Prime Minister became a pleasure rather than a chore, and it is widely reported that a healthy mutual respect grew between them, underpinned by mutual admiration for the ways in which they both discharged their duties to the country. As ever, the Prime Minister's audience with the monarch is kept absolutely confidential. They meet once a week, every week, and there is no record kept of anything said during these meetings. It is just the Queen and the Prime Minister, with no witnesses, no recordings, or minutes taken. However, those waiting outside, whilst unable to hear the exact details of their conversations, have told of times when they would hear roaring laughter coming from the room. Churchill would often emerge from their audience, wiping his eyes from tears of laughter and chuckling to himself as he made his way back to the cut and thrust of the political world. As a young and inexperienced queen, and with Churchill being her first Prime Minister, it is said that he coached her thoroughly in the complexities and intricacies of British politics, the Constitution, and the government. With his many years of wisdom and diplomacy, it is thought that the Queen was enormously grateful for his knowledge and guidance, particularly during those early years as she found her feet, determined to keep her promise of devoting her life to her duties to her people. Over time, Churchill and his Queen grew closer and developed an enduring friendship. His respect and appreciation for the monarchy only grew, and it is believed that the Queen held great affection and fondness for Winston. But it wasn't a perfect relationship between the Queen and her Prime Minister. Years before, in 1947, the Queen had married Prince Philip, then known by his newly adopted surname Philip Mountbatten, that of his uncle Lord Mountbatten. Needless to say, it is common for a woman to take the surname of her husband, and for their descendants also to share that surname. Lord Mountbatten then declared it was the House of Mountbatten that reigned. However, when Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth's grandmother, heard of the plan, she spoke with Churchill, and they agreed that it must remain the House of Windsor. Queen Elizabeth agreed and issued a royal proclamation declaring such. Famously, Prince Philip was aggrieved by this and said, "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba. I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." The grandiosity of the royal wedding was also a topic of debate within the royal walls.
Well, when Elizabeth and Philip got engaged, they decided that because London was ravaged by war and a lot of the buildings were absolutely rubble, and there was unemployment, there was rationing, it was in a really bad place. The government or the king thought, well, let's have a very quiet wedding at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. No pomp, no ceremony, we'll just, be very private. But then the government, surprisingly, said, no, 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 we need to lift the people's spirits. Let's have a beautiful royal wedding that everybody can see. So that is what ended up happening. And it was televised, and eventually the television got to America. So it became a global affair, and it did lift people's spirits in London hugely. To see this beautiful young couple married, no one had seen anything like that for the years of the war.
Another alleged small rift grew between Churchill, the Queen, and Prince Philip. Buckingham Palace is the official London residence of the sovereign, and Churchill insisted that the Queen and Prince Philip move in immediately. This caused some considerable dismay to the royal couple, as they had put a great deal of time and effort into creating a home for themselves at Clarence House. There was, reportedly, significant pushback and upset, but they eventually agreed and moved into Buckingham Palace, reputed at the time to be cold, drafty and damp.
Well, I think Prince Philip never envisaged that his young princess would become queen so quickly. They thought they had years ahead of them. So I think it was very difficult when suddenly his wife became queen. And he was demoted, if you like, to forever walk 2 steps behind. And he was treated very badly by the stuffy old courtiers at the palace. And they thought he was an interloper. He was far too German. And although he was a Greek prince, he had a lot of German blood, so they just called him, just thought he was German. And so it was very, very difficult for him.
3 weeks after the coronation, Churchill's health went into rapid decline. He had a sudden and significant stroke, causing partial paralysis. He was taken back to his home, Chartwell, and given time to recover. However, this was kept secret from the House of Commons and from the Queen. They were told he was suffering from exhaustion, but the truth was revealed a year later, much to the surprise of them all. King George VI had been trying to persuade Winston to retire, as he and his wife were concerned over Winston's health. Ironically, the King's death and the introduction of the new monarch gave Churchill reason to carry on and to maintain some degree of continuity. The ill health of Churchill's successor, Anthony Eden, was another reason for Winston to carry on. Eden had had an abdominal operation that didn't go quite to plan, so Churchill remained in place as Prime Minister. Churchill resigned as Prime Minister in 1955 at 80 years of age, though he remained a Member of Parliament for several years thereafter. With advancing years and in poor health, he was past his prime, and during those last few years, much of his work had been conducted from his bedside. During his illness, Queen Elizabeth wrote a letter to Churchill stating that no Prime Minister would be able to hold the place of my first Prime Minister, to whom both my husband and I owe so much, and for whose wise guidance during the early years of my reign I shall always be so profoundly grateful. Churchill described the Queen as understanding her duties as a sovereign by instinct and of fulfilling her duties in exemplary fashion. Both publicly and privately, he heaped praise for the work she was doing. Churchill continued as an MP until the general election in 1964. 1965. Winston Churchill died on the 24th of January 1965, aged 90, following another stroke. Plans for Churchill's funeral, known as Operation Hope Not, were put into action. Royal protocol dictates the Queen should be the last person to arrive at any function, but for Churchill, rules were broken. the Queen chose to break with tradition on this occasion as she arrived before his family. They were then asked to join the Queen. This was an extraordinarily sad occasion for so many. The loss of a true statesman, a veritable and courageous war hero, and the most admired and revered leader of the time. Tens of thousands gathered and waited in line to pay their respects. Churchill was undoubtedly one of the most renowned political figures and leaders of all time. With such a reputation, it was clear that there was a great sense of mourning around the nation upon his death. It had been decided that he would have a state funeral, a very rare occurrence, usually reserved for royalty and people of very great significance. In a 2002 BBC poll, Winston Churchill was voted the greatest Briton ever, mainly for his efforts during the Second World War. Though he was an undoubtedly skilled strategist and war hero, Churchill's power lay in his eloquence in his speech and writing. When weaponry and resources were limited, it was his high-impact speeches that rallied Britons to believe they could win the war. He would come to epitomize the very essence of Britain's wartime spirit, as a passionate patriot and with complete devotion to the British Empire and to the Queen's father, King George VI. Churchill thrived on what remains as one of Britain's greatest challenges in history, World War II. The very basis on which a Prime Minister is chosen is that they can command confidence in their administration, and there is little doubt of Churchill's ability to lead and to unite the nation. In recognition of his devoted service, King George VI had offered Churchill the Order of the Garter, but Churchill had refused it, as he had just been defeated in the election. However, shortly before the coronation, Queen Elizabeth offered it to him again in April 1953, and as he was at that time, the Prime Minister accepted. The Order of the Garter is the most senior order of knighthood in the British honour system, outranked only by the Victoria Cross and the George Cross, and only awarded to the most distinguished and genuinely deserving. Sir Winston Churchill will always be her first Prime Minister.
This great parliamentary institution, the Palace of Westminster, is going to miss Winston Churchill, perhaps more than it's missed any other previous parliamentarian. He has been a great Parliament man. He loved the place, and the place loved him.